The 1920s could be described as the decade of conveniences. During the 1920s, new products were made to make household chores easier and more efficient, leaving more time for leisure. Products that were, in previous years, too expensive for the middle class to buy became much more affordable during this time. New forms of financing let nearly every family spend money beyond their means. Advertising capitalized on people's hopes, dreams, and fears to sell more products. By now, pay later became the motto of many American families during the Roaring '20s. For families with only one breadwinner, all the new conveniences were too expensive to get all at once. Department stores began offering lines of credit to those who could not pay immediately but showed the ability to pay in the future. Lines of credit were the largest contributor to consumer debt. Installment plans were offered to those who could not afford a total sum but could afford 12 easy payments. Over 50% of the nation's cars were sold on credit by the end of the 20s. All of this contributed to the consumer debt that doubled between 1920 and 1930. New advertising techniques fueled consumer demand. The increasingly competitive marketplace caused manufacturers to fund more aggressive ad campaigns. One major trend during this time was using psychology on their viewers. Take a Listerine ad, for example. Instead of using the term bad breath, they use halitosis. Consumers may not know what halitosis is, but they know they don't want to have it. In the 1920s, advertisers were not just responding to consumer demand, they were creating it. By the end of World War I, the American people no longer supported any of Democratic President Woodrow Wilson's domestic or foreign policies. In 1920, they elected Republican Senator Warren G. Harding to the presidency. Harding ran under the slogan, "Return to Normalcy." Normalcy meant that his government would be pro-business, anti-tax, and anti-regulation. Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, cut income tax for wealthy Americans from 73% to 25%. This fueled the stock market. It also, however, increased the misdistribution of wealth in America. In order to make the regulatory agencies made under Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson ineffective, Harding put officials from the industries meant to be regulated in charge of them. Many of these new regulation officers were not only deeply opposed to regulation, but corrupt as well. This caused many of the departments to be riddled with scandals, costing taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. The biggest of which was the Teapot Dome scandal, in which Harding's Secretary of the Interior accepted $500,000 in bribes to give oil companies federal oil reserves. Harding died of a stroke while on a speaking tour during his third year in his presidency. Harding's replacement was Calvin Coolidge, nicknamed Silent Cal. He had almost no personal charisma, but was widely respected. This respectability helped Republicans win the election again, despite Warren G. Harding's scandals. Coolidge was famous for his declaration that the business of America is business. He easily won a second term, keeping Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary. The result was Coolidge prosperity, half a decade of economic growth, and widespread affluence. When Coolidge retired as a civilian in 1928, his successor was Republican Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a former mining engineer, war relief administrator, and Secretary of Commerce. Hoover was a self-made millionaire but did not staunchly adhere to laissez-faire. He believed that the government should encourage private business with benefits. This helped prevent a post-war depression during his years as Secretary of Commerce. Months after Hoover assumed his office, the stock market crashed, ushering in the Great Depression. In the 1920s, modernism refers to a set of modern social and cultural values. These values were most prominent among the urban middle class. Modernism celebrated the new and the now of the times. This included secularism, faith in science and human progress, as well as a rejection of traditional social values and sexual morals. Advancements in science and technology were happening at incredible paces. Discovery about the fundamental nature of science contributed to a secularist view. Advancements such as the mastery of flight convinced people that the 20s was an age of boldness. Literature also reflected the secularism and changing values. F. Scott Fitzgerald challenged the attainability of the American dream of wealth and affluence. Ernest Hemingway embodied the disillusionment of the lost generation of American expatriates lingering in Europe after the war. William Faulkner wrote of the moral decline and decay of the South in his series of novels based in a fictional Mississippi county. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston explored African American culture and disenfranchisement as part of a larger black artistic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans were a source of one of the most popular music of the 1920s, jazz. During this time, the radio forever changed the way the news and entertainment was received in America. Films were revolutionized with the creation of new technology, allowing for the first talking films. While many younger Americans rejoiced in the new philosophies and lifestyles of modernism, the rapid cultural transformation of the 1920s was alarming to many. Religious fundamentalists were especially dismissive of secular modernism. The most notable confrontation between the two worldviews came in 1925 over the issue of Darwinian evolution, the so-called Scopes monkey trial, centered on the teaching of evolution in a Tennessee high school. The trial quickly became a theological referendum, pitting modernism versus fundamentalism, science versus religion. Related to both fundamentalism and nativism, the prohibition of alcohol was achieved in 1919 with the ratification of the 18th Amendment and its enforcement via the Volstead Act. An example of the resurgence of nativist movements is the revival of the KKK, which was reorganized at St. One Mountain, Georgia in 1915. Its anti-black, anti-Jew, anti-Catholic, anti-anything but white Anglo-Saxon Protestant rhetoric found fertile ground across the nation. A more decidedly conservative reaction prevailed with regard to immigration. Congress restricted immigration in 1921, followed by even more restrictive laws in 1924. The Great Migration of African Americans to northern and western cities that began during the war continued through the 1920s. Southern blacks faced complete disenfranchisement. The resurgence of the KKK brought terror to the doorstep of many African Americans, and even in northern cities, blacks were segregated into ghettos and faced discrimination at every turn. Racial violence erupted in many cities, including examples in Chicago in 1919 and Tulsa in 1921, of which they are the most notorious. The long battle for women's suffrage finally ended with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Educationally and economic opportunities continued to expand for women during the 1920s. But full economic and socio-political efficacy remained a distant vision, a vision some would argue is one that is yet to be fulfilled.